The first thing Elias Drennan did after arriving in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana Territory on April 14, 1879, was pace off the distance between 4 newly built cabins and write a number in charcoal on the back of his hand, 47 feet. That was the farthest gap from the northeast corner of the Hargrove cabin to the southwest corner of his own. The shortest distance between the Meriwether and Colville structures was 19 feet. He stood in the mud between those 4 buildings, squinting at the sky like he was measuring something nobody else could see, and he said one sentence to his wife, Catherine, that would define the next 11 months of his life and, eventually, the next 30 years of settlement design in the northern Rockies. He said, "One chimney could do all of this." By the end of that week, every family in the small clearing along Sleeping Creek knew what Elias Drennan was proposing, and every single one of them thought he had lost his mind. He wanted to connect 4 separate cabins, 4 independent households belonging to 4 unrelated families, with enclosed timber corridors, route a single masonry flue system through a central junction structure, and heat all 4 dwellings, plus the shared central space with 1 fire. Not 1 fireplace per cabin, 1 fireplace total, for 4 families, through a Montana winter. Thomas Hargrove, 53 years old and a veteran of 14 winters in Dakota Territory before relocating west, was the first to say it plainly. "You will kill every person in those cabins," he told Drennan on April 19th, standing in the clearing with his arms folded across his chest. "1 chimney fails, 1 flue cracks, and you have got carbon monoxide in 4 homes instead of 1. That is not innovation. That is arithmetic for a funeral." Hargrove's concern was not trivial. It was, in fact, the single most legitimate objection anyone would raise in the months ahead, and Elias Drennan knew it. He had watched his own uncle die of carbon monoxide poisoning in a poorly ventilated cabin in Minnesota in 1861. He was 9 years old. He remembered the blue tinge of his uncle's lips and the way the cabin smelled like nothing at all. No smoke, no char, just the ordinary smell of pine and wool blankets while a man died in his sleep 15 feet away. He carried that memory the way other men carried war wounds, and it had driven him to spend the next 18 years studying exactly how heat moves through enclosed spaces, how draft systems function, and how masonry flue construction could be made not merely adequate, but redundant in its safety. Elias Drennan was not a dreamer proposing an untested theory. He was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades preparing to solve a problem that had haunted him since childhood. Before Montana, Drennan had worked for 6 years as a mason's apprentice in St. Paul, where he helped construct the heating systems for 3 commercial buildings, including the Ramsey County Courthouse Annex, completed in 1873. He had studied, with particular intensity, the Hippocaust heating systems described in translations of Roman architectural texts available at the St. Paul Athenaeum Library. He had also spent 2 winters with a Swedish immigrant community near Lindstrom, Minnesota, where he observed how connected farmstead designs, where house, barn, and workshop shared walls and heat circulation, allowed families to survive brutal winters with roughly 40% less firewood than their American-born neighbors who insisted on separate, independent structures. The mathematics fascinated him. The Swedish families burned between 8 and 11 cords of wood per winter. The American families surrounding them, with comparable square footage but separate buildings, burned between 16 and 22 cords. Same climate, same elevation, same wind exposure. The difference was geometry and thermodynamics, not luck or constitution. The Swedes were not tougher, they were more efficient, and efficiency, Drennan had come to believe, was the difference between surviving a northern winter and being slowly consumed by it. So, when he stood in that muddy clearing in April of 1879 and looked at 4 cabins arranged in a rough quadrilateral with gaps of 19 to 47 feet between them, he did not see 4 separate problems. He saw one system waiting to be connected, but he needed the other 3 families to agree because the construction would require modifying their cabins, cutting through exterior walls, reinforcing floor joists to support corridor weight, and surrendering a degree of household independence that frontier families guarded with near religious intensity. The Meriwethers were the first to listen seriously. James Meriwether was 31, a former railroad laborer who had broken his right leg in a track-laying accident near Helena the previous summer and walked with a pronounced limp that would never fully heal. His wife, Anne, was 27 and pregnant with their second child, due in late September. They had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley with less than $40 in savings, a single-room cabin that James had built in 11 days with green timber that was already beginning to warp, and a quietly desperate understanding that their first Montana winter could very easily be their last. When Drennan laid out his proposal on the Merryweather's rough-hewn table on April 22nd, using charcoal sketches on brown paper to illustrate the corridor system, the flue routing, and the central hearth design, James Merryweather asked exactly one question: how much wood? Drennan had calculated this already. 4 separate cabins, each maintaining its own fire through a Montana winter averaging 23 degrees Fahrenheit from November through March, with regular periods below zero, would require a combined total of approximately 68 to 75 cords of firewood. His connected system, with a single high-efficiency hearth feeding radiant heat through masonry channels and enclosed corridors acting as thermal buffers, would require between 14 and 19 cords. James Merryweather stared at the numbers for a long time. He looked at his wife. He looked at his splinted leg, which made every trip to a woodpile an exercise in controlled agony. He looked back at Drennan. "Show me where to dig," he said. The Colvilles were harder to convince. Margaret Colville was a 44-year-old widow from Ohio who had buried her husband on the trail near Fort Hall the previous autumn and completed the journey to Montana with her 3 children, Samuel, 16, David, 12, and Eleanor, 8, through what she later described in a letter to her sister as the most relentless act of stubbornness I have ever committed or witnessed. Margaret Colville did not trust easily, did not delegate critical decisions, and did not, as a fundamental principle, attach her family's survival to the judgment of a man she had known for 8 days. "I have seen men with plans before, Mr. Drennan," she told him on April 23rd, standing in the doorway of her cabin with a posture that communicated the conversation's likely brevity. "My husband had a plan to reach Montana before the first snow. He had a plan to ford a river that he had never seen before. He had a plan for everything except what actually happened. I will keep my own fireplace." Drennan did not argue. He simply asked if she would permit him to build the corridor to her cabin wall and leave the connecting doorway sealed until she decided otherwise. The corridor would provide additional wind protection to her west-facing wall regardless. Margaret Colville considered this for 11 seconds. Drennan counted and said, "You may build to my wall. You may not build through it." It was, for the moment, enough. Thomas Hargrove remained the most vocal opponent. He visited Drennan's cabin on 3 separate occasions in late April and early May to enumerate his objections, and to his credit, they were thorough. Beyond the carbon monoxide concern, Hargrove raised the issue of fire spread. A blaze in one cabin could race through enclosed corridors and consume all 4 structures before anyone could respond. He raised the question of structural integrity. The corridors would need to bear snow loads while also connecting to cabin walls that had been designed as independent load-bearing structures. He raised the social dimension that nobody else was willing to articulate directly. 4 families sharing one fire means 4 families sharing one decision about when to stoke it, when to bank it, and who sleeps closest to the warmth. I have seen men fight over less. This last objection was perhaps the most perceptive thing anyone said during the entire project, and Drennan would later acknowledge that Hargrove had identified the one problem that engineering alone could not solve. But that acknowledgement came later. In late April, Drennan simply responded to each concern in sequence. For carbon monoxide, he described the dual flue system he intended to build, 2 completely independent draft channels within the same masonry structure, so that if one cracked or became obstructed, the second would continue to vent combustion gases safely. He also described the telltale indicators he would install, small wool threads suspended in the draft channels at visible inspection points that would flutter visibly when draft was functioning and hang limp if airflow was compromised. For fire spread, he explained that the corridors would incorporate fire doors, heavy timber doors lined with a layer of river clay applied over green hide, at each junction point, designed to be closed in the event of a fire in any single structure, isolating it from the system. For snow loading, he produced his most detailed sketches. The corridor roofs would be built at a steep 38-degree pitch, supported by paired rafters at 18-inch intervals rather than the standard 36, effectively doubling the structural capacity. For the social question, Drennan had no engineering solution. He simply said, "We will have to figure that out together, or this does not work." Hargrove listened to all of it. He examined the sketches. He asked 4 follow-up questions about the dual flue design, each one more specific than the last, revealing a mechanical understanding that Drennan had not expected from a man who presented himself primarily as a farmer and hunter. Then Hargrove folded his arms again and said, "I will watch you build it. If I am satisfied with the flue construction before the first frost, I will connect. If I am not satisfied, I will cut the corridor at my wall and seal it, and you will not argue." Drennan agreed. He had 4 families, one fully committed, one willing to connect structurally but not thermally, one conditional on inspection, and his own. It was enough to begin. Construction started on May 3, 1879, and from the first day, the scale of what Drennan had proposed became viscerally apparent to everyone in the clearing. The central structure, which Drennan called the Junction Hall, would measure 14 feet by 14 feet, with a floor-to-ceiling height of 9 feet, to accommodate the masonry hearth assembly that would serve as the system's thermal core. The hearth itself was not a conventional fireplace. It was a masonry stove design adapted from Finnish and Russian models that Drennan had studied in translated texts and observed in modified form among Scandinavian settlers in Minnesota. The principle was fundamentally different from an open fireplace. Instead of allowing hot combustion gases to escape directly up a chimney, wasting approximately 85% of the heat energy in the process, a masonry stove routes those gases through a series of internal channels within a large thermal mass before venting them. The gases give up their heat to the surrounding stone and brick, which then radiates that heat slowly and steadily into the living space for hours after the fire itself has burned down. A conventional fireplace heats a room to 65 degrees while the fire is burning and allows it to drop to 35 degrees by morning. A properly constructed masonry stove heats a room to 65 degrees and maintains 58 to 62 degrees for 8 to 12 hours after the last log is added. The difference in fuel consumption is not incremental, it is transformational. Drennan needed approximately 4,000 pounds of stone and river rock for the hearth assembly, plus 240 bricks that he would have to make himself from local clay. The nearest source of commercially produced brick was Fort Missoula, 63 miles north, and the cost of freighting sufficient quantity was beyond any of the 4 families' means. So he dug clay from the creek bank, built wooden molds, and began firing bricks in a pit kiln he constructed 200 yards from the cabins on May 9th. Each firing cycle produced between 30 and 40 usable bricks and took 3 days. He would need 6 to 7 complete cycles. While the bricks accumulated, Drennan and James Merriweather, who could not dig or carry heavy loads but could measure, mark, and saw with precision from a seated position, began felling and preparing the timber for the corridor frames. The corridors would be 7 feet wide and 7 feet tall, framed with paired lodgepole pine logs at the base and ridge with vertical studs every 18 inches, and sheathed on the exterior with overlapping split cedar planks that Drennan cut from 4 massive western red cedar trees he found 2 miles up the creek. The interior surfaces would be lined with a layer of dried moss packed between the studs, then sealed with a mixture of clay and grass that Drennan called frontier plaster, a technique he had learned from the Swedish families in Minnesota. It provided reasonable insulation and, critically, created an airtight interior surface that would prevent drafts from undermining the heating system's efficiency. If you value these stories of practical wisdom and forgotten ingenuity, consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription helps us continue researching and sharing the knowledge that our ancestors developed through hard experience, knowledge that is being lost with each passing generation. The mathematics of what Drennan was attempting were straightforward but unforgiving. The 4 corridors radiating from the central junction hall to the 4 cabins totaled 147 linear feet of enclosed insulated passage. Each foot of corridor represented approximately 6 hours of labor in felling, preparing, framing, sheathing, and sealing. That was 882 hours of corridor construction alone, not counting the junction hall, the hearth assembly, the brickmaking, or the modifications to each cabin's exterior wall. 2 men, one of them injured, working 12-hour days, had roughly 180 working days between May and the end of October. That was 2,160 available labor hours, and the total project, by Drennan's estimate, required approximately 2,400 hours. He was short by 240 hours before he began. He solved this deficit through 3 strategies. First, he enlisted Samuel Colville, Margaret's 16-year-old son, who was strong, willing, and motivated by the simple fact that he had spent the previous winter in a cabin that regularly dropped below freezing at night. Samuel could not be paid, so Drennan offered him something more valuable: knowledge. He taught the boy joinery techniques, masonry principles, and the mathematics of structural loading as they worked, effectively providing an apprenticeship in exchange for labor. Second, Drennan worked by lantern light for 2 hours each evening through June and July, when the days were longest, adding 14 hours per week to the schedule. Third, and most importantly, he reduced the complexity of 2 of the 4 corridors by taking advantage of terrain. The Meriwether and Hargrove cabins were positioned at slightly higher elevation than the Junction Hall site, which meant their corridors could use a simpler post and beam foundation rather than the full log crib foundation required for the corridors running to the Colville and Drennan cabins, which crossed lower, wetter ground. This saved approximately 90 hours of foundation work. By July 15th, the Junction Hall frame was standing. The foundation trenches for all 4 corridors were dug, and 1,100 of the needed bricks were fired and stacked under canvas. The clearing along Sleeping Creek now looked, from a distance, like something between a construction site and a fever dream. 4 small cabins connected by skeletal timber frameworks radiating from a central square structure that had no walls yet, but already had a 9-foot stone foundation for its hearth. People noticed. Word traveled along the valley, and by late July, Drennan's project had attracted a small but steady stream of visitors, settlers from as far as 12 miles away who came to see what one man was trying to build. The reactions followed a consistent pattern. First, curiosity, then examination, then skepticism delivered with varying degrees of politeness. A man named Orrin Pratt, who ran a small trading post at the confluence of Sleeping Creek and the Bitterroot River, visited on July 22nd and spent 2 hours walking the site before rendering his verdict. "I have seen men build bigger things that fell down faster," he said. "You are connecting green timber to seasoned walls, running heat through passages that will collect moisture and rot from the inside out within 2 years, and trusting your family's life to a chimney design that not one builder in this territory has ever attempted. And you are doing this because you read a book about Romans." It was a fair summary of the conventional view, and Pratt was not wrong about every detail. The green timber concern was legitimate. Freshly cut logs contain moisture that causes them to shrink and shift as they season, potentially opening gaps in joints and seals. Drennan's response was characteristically precise. He had selected lodgepole pine specifically because its shrinkage rate was among the lowest of available species, approximately 3.4% radially and 6.7% tangentially during seasoning, compared to Douglas fir at 4.8% and 7.6% respectively. He had also oversized every joint by a calculated margin and used a wedge and pin fastening system that could be tightened as the wood shrank, rather than rigid nail connections that would resist the wood's natural movement and crack. "The wood will move," Drennan told Pratt. "I am not fighting the movement. I am planning for it." Pratt was unconvinced. He told 3 other families on his way home that Drennan was building an elaborate coffin for 4 families, and that phrase, elaborate coffin, would follow the project through the summer and into the fall. The moisture concern was addressed through a detail that most visitors missed entirely because it was invisible once completed. Between the interior plaster layer and the exterior sheathing of each corridor, Drennan left a 1.5-inch air gap. This was not accidental, and it was not empty space waiting to be filled. It was a ventilation channel. At the base of each corridor's exterior wall, he installed small screened openings, 3 inches by 6 inches, spaced every 4 feet. At the peak of the corridor roof, he cut matching ventilation slots. The principle was simple. Any moisture that migrated through the interior plaster layer or condensed on the interior surface of the exterior sheathing would encounter moving air in the gap, which would carry the moisture upward and out through the roof vents before it could accumulate and cause rot. This was, in essence, the same principle used in modern rain screen wall assemblies, developed formally in building science approximately 70 years later. Drennan had arrived at it not through academic research, but through observation. He had seen the rot patterns in failed Swedish corridor barns in Minnesota, and noticed that the structures which survived had been built with inadvertent air gaps due to irregular log surfaces, while the more carefully fitted structures paradoxically, rotted faster because they trapped moisture with no escape path. The gap was a lesson learned from failure, applied with intention. August brought the first serious test of Drennan's planning, though not the kind he had anticipated. On August 11th, a thunderstorm produced a lightning strike that hit a ponderosa pine approximately 130 yards from the clearing and started a ground fire that burned through 3 acres of dry grass before a shift in wind direction and a second burst of rain extinguished it. The fire never reached the cabins or the construction site, but it came close enough, within an estimated 60 yards, that every family in the clearing spent 4 hours that night wetting down roofs and walls with water hauled from the creek. The experience sharpened Thomas Hargrove's concerns about fire spread through the corridor system considerably. He visited Drennan the following morning and stated, in a voice that Drennan would later describe as controlled fury, that connecting 4 wooden structures with wooden passages was an invitation to lose everything rather than something. "A fire takes 1 cabin. A family can move into another," Hargrove said. "A fire takes all 4, because you have built highways for flame, and there is nothing left. Nothing. No shelter, no supplies, no tools. 4 families in the open in November. Do you understand what that means?" Drennan understood. He modified his fire door design that same week, adding a second door at each corridor junction, creating a double-door airlock arrangement with a 3-foot vestibule between them. He also added sand-filled wooden troughs mounted at the ceiling of each vestibule, designed so that pulling a rope would overturn the trough and dump approximately 40 pounds of sand onto the vestibule floor, smothering any fire attempting to cross the gap. It was not a perfect system, but it transformed the corridors from potential fire highways into defensible barriers with 2 physical interruptions in any fire's path. Hargrove examined the modified design on August 19th. He said nothing for several minutes. Then he asked, "Where are you getting the sand?" Drennan pointed to a gravel bar in Sleeping Creek, about 300 yards downstream. Hargrove nodded. "I will haul sand tomorrow," he said. It was not an endorsement, but it was participation, and in the careful algebra of frontier cooperation, participation was worth more than approval. September arrived with urgency. Anne Merriweather gave birth to a daughter on September 3rd, a healthy child they named Clara, and the arrival underscored the stakes of the project with an immediacy that no engineering argument could match. There was now an infant who would spend her first winter in whatever system these families chose, and the difference between a cabin that held 58 degrees at dawn and one that dropped to 32 degrees was, for a newborn, not a matter of comfort, but of survival. Infant mortality in Montana Territory in 1879 was estimated at approximately 230 per 1,000 live births. Nearly 1 in 4 children did not survive their first year, and exposure-related illness during winter months was the leading contributing factor after infectious disease. If you find value in understanding how our ancestors engineered solutions to problems that still challenge us today, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates practical history. These stories survive only when people choose to pass them along. Drennan pushed the construction schedule to its breaking point through September and October. The junction hall walls went up in the first 2 weeks of September, double-thick log construction with clay chinking, creating a structure that was essentially a 14 by 14 foot insulated box with a massive stone and brick hearth assembly occupying its entire north wall. The hearth itself was Drennan's masterwork. It stood 7 feet tall and 8 feet wide at its base, containing a firebox large enough to accept logs up to 30 inches in length, surrounded by a labyrinth of internal flue channels that wound through approximately 47 linear feet of masonry before reaching the chimney. The thermal mass of the complete hearth assembly was approximately 6,200 pounds of stone, brick, and clay. Drennan had calculated, based on the thermal storage capacity of the materials used, that this mass could absorb and store enough heat from a single large fire to radiate warmth for approximately 14 hours. 2 fires per day, one in the morning and one in the evening, would maintain the junction hall and, through the corridor system, all 4 connected cabins at survivable temperatures even when exterior temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The corridors were not merely passages. They were part of the heating system. Each corridor was sealed and insulated to prevent heat loss, and their connection to both the junction hall and the individual cabins meant that warm air from the central hearth would migrate through the corridors via natural convection. Warm air rising in the junction hall, flowing outward through the upper portions of each corridor, cooling as it reached the cabin, and returning along the corridor floor as it was replaced by warmer air behind it. Drennan had designed the corridor to cabin openings with adjustable wooden dampers that each family could use to regulate the flow of warm air into their cabin, effectively giving each household independent temperature control within the shared system. This addressed Hargrove's concern about who controlled the heat. Nobody controlled all of it. Everybody controlled their own. The damper system was elegant in its simplicity. Each opening was approximately 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, a standard doorway, but was fitted with a sliding panel of 2-inch thick pine that could be positioned to cover the opening fully, partially, or not at all. Fully open, a cabin received maximum heat flow from the junction hall. Fully closed, it was thermally independent, relying only on whatever residual heat existed in the corridor itself. Most families, Drennan predicted, would settle on a partially open position that maintained comfortable temperatures without overheating. The first frost came on October 2nd. The system was not complete. 2 of the 4 corridors, those running to the Hargrove and Drennan cabins, were fully sheathed, sealed, and insulated. The Merriweather corridor was sheathed, but not yet fully sealed along its lower walls. The Colville corridor was the most problematic. It was framed and roofed, but had no interior ceiling, and, more critically, had no opening through the Colville cabin wall. Margaret Colville had not changed her position. She would accept the corridor as a windbreak against her west wall, but she would not connect her cabin to the system. Drennan did not press her. He focused on completing the Merriweather corridor and finishing the hearth's internal flue channels, which required precise brick placement to ensure proper draft through the labyrinthine passages. Each brick had to be set with clay mortar at a specific angle to create smooth directional changes in the flue path. Sharp corners would create turbulence, reduce draft velocity, and allow creosote to accumulate at the turning points. Drennan spent 6 full days in the first 2 weeks of October doing nothing but brickwork inside the hearth assembly, working by the light of tallow candles in a space barely large enough to turn around in, setting each brick with the concentration of a man who understood that a single poorly placed unit could compromise the entire system's safety. On October 17th, he built the first fire. It was a small test fire, 3 split pine logs, approximately 8 pounds of fuel total, intended not to heat the system, but to verify draft function and identify any leaks in the flue channels. He positioned Samuel Colville and James Merriweather at inspection points along the flue path, each one watching the wool telltales he had installed at 6 locations in the dual channel system. All 12 telltales, 6 in each independent flue, fluttered steadily toward the chimney, indicating positive draft in both channels. No smoke leaked from any joint or seam in the masonry. The exterior chimney, which rose 11 feet above the junction hall's roofline, produced a clean, steady column of white smoke that bent eastward in the light afternoon breeze. Drennan watched for 40 minutes. He checked every accessible joint with the back of his hand, feeling for the warmth that would indicate a leak. He found nothing. He built the fire larger, adding 2 more logs, and watched for another hour. The thermal mass began to absorb heat. He could feel the stone surface of the hearth warming under his palm, slowly, steadily, like a living thing drawing breath. 4 hours after the test, fire burned down to coals. The surface temperature of the hearth's exterior stones was still warm enough to be felt clearly at arm's length. The system worked. Thomas Hargrove walked into the junction hall at 6 o'clock that evening, stood with his hand on the still warm hearthstone, and said nothing for a very long time. Then he went home, picked up a saw, and cut the opening through his cabin wall that would connect his home to the corridor. He did it without announcement, without discussion, and without asking permission. His wife, Ruth, later told Catherine Drennan that Thomas had not spoken a word during the entire process. He simply measured, cut, framed the opening, and installed the sliding damper panel that Drennan had pre-built weeks earlier in quiet confidence that this moment would come. By October 24th, 3 of the 4 cabins were fully connected to the system. The Drennan cabin, the Hargrove cabin, and the Merriweather cabin each had sealed, insulated corridors leading to the junction hall, with functioning damper controls and dual access to the central hearth's radiant heat. The Colville corridor remained an unconnected windbreak, sealed on the junction hall end, but meeting a solid log wall on the Colville end. Margaret Colville's 12-year-old son, David, had taken to sitting in the corridor during the afternoons, where residual heat from the junction hall made it noticeably warmer than anywhere in their cabin. His mother did not comment on this, but she did not stop him. The first real snow fell on November 9th, 4 inches of wet, heavy snow that clung to every surface and dropped the overnight temperature to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Drennan built the first operational fire in the hearth at 5 o'clock that morning, using a carefully measured load of 8 split pine logs totaling approximately 42 pounds. By 7 o'clock, the junction hall was 64 degrees. By 8:30, with the corridor dampers open, all 3 connected cabins were registering between 54 and 58 degrees. The variation attributable to differences in corridor length and each cabin's individual insulation quality. The Merriweather's cabin, with the shortest corridor at 19 feet but the poorest wall construction due to the green timber warping, stabilized at 54 degrees. The Hargrove cabin, with a 47-foot corridor but substantially better wall construction, reached 58 degrees. Drennan's own cabin, at 31 feet from the junction hall, held 57 degrees. Outside, it was 14 degrees and falling. Inside 3 cabins and a junction hall, it was warm enough that Anne Merriweather nursed baby Clara without wrapping her in the double wool blankets that had been necessary every morning for the past week. That single image, a mother nursing an infant in relative comfort while snow accumulated on the windows, contained the entire argument for the system more eloquently than any measurement or calculation could express. But Drennan measured and calculated anyway, because that was who he was. He recorded temperatures every 2 hours for the first 72 hours of continuous operation, noting fuel consumption, hearth surface temperature, ambient temperature at 5 locations within the system, and exterior temperature. The data was unambiguous. 3 cabins and a junction hall totaling approximately 1,100 square feet of heated space were being maintained at an average interior temperature of 57 degrees, using 2 fires per day, consuming a combined total of approximately 78 pounds of split firewood. An equivalent heating load using 4 independent fireplaces would have required approximately 260 pounds of wood per day, the difference representing not a marginal improvement, but a 70% reduction in fuel consumption. 70%. Over a 5-month winter, that translated to approximately 14 cords of wood for the connected system versus approximately 48 cords for 4 independent fireplaces. The implications for labor were equally dramatic. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking 48 cords of firewood represented approximately 576 hours of heavy physical labor that had to be completed before winter set in, by people who were simultaneously building cabins, clearing land, hunting, preserving food, and managing livestock. 14 cords required approximately 168 hours. That was 408 hours returned to other survival tasks. For James Merriweather, with his broken leg, those 408 hours were not an abstraction. They were the difference between adequacy and desperation, between a family that entered spring with reserves and one that entered spring depleted. November and December passed with the system performing consistently within Drennan's predictions. He adjusted the fire schedule based on exterior temperature. On milder days above 25 degrees, a single morning fire sustained the system through the evening. On colder days below 10 degrees, he built a second fire at 4 in the afternoon. The thermal mass of the hearth proved to be the system's most critical advantage. It smoothed out the temperature fluctuations that plagued conventional fireplaces, where the cabins swung between overheated and frigid as the fire blazed and died. In the connected system, the temperature variation within any 24-hour period rarely exceeded 8 degrees, a stability that affected not just comfort, but health, sleep quality, and the preservation of food stores kept inside the cabins. Consider subscribing if these stories of practical engineering and frontier ingenuity resonate with you. This channel is dedicated to preserving the kind of knowledge that was once passed from hand to hand, neighbor to neighbor, and that risks disappearing entirely if we do not make the effort to document it. The crisis came on January 14, 1880. A blizzard moved into the Bitterroot Valley from the northwest, beginning at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, bringing winds that the Missoula Weather Station 63 miles north would record at sustained speeds of 44 miles per hour, with gusts estimated at 60. The temperature, which had been 9 degrees above zero at noon, dropped to 11 below by 6 o'clock and continued falling. By midnight, the thermometer that Drennan had mounted on the north exterior wall of the junction hall read 27 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Snow fell at a rate of approximately 2 inches per hour, driven nearly horizontal by the wind. Visibility dropped to less than 15 feet. The storm would last 41 hours. Drennan's system faced its ultimate examination under conditions more extreme than anything he had designed for. His thermal calculations had been based on a minimum exterior temperature of 20 below zero. The storm exceeded that by 7 degrees and sustained wind speeds that dramatically increased heat loss through every surface. At the storm's onset, Drennan immediately shifted to a continuous fire protocol, maintaining an active blaze in the hearth around the clock rather than relying on the thermal mass to coast between fires. This increased fuel consumption significantly. He burned approximately 130 pounds of wood per 24-hour period, roughly double his normal usage. But the thermal mass continued to serve its primary function of smoothing heat delivery, absorbing excess energy during the active burn phase, and releasing it steadily when the fire was being rebuilt. The corridors became the system's most valuable feature during the storm, and in a way that Drennan had anticipated, but that the other families had not fully appreciated until the wind began to howl. In a conventional settlement, every trip to the woodpile was a potentially fatal exposure to conditions that could disorient and kill a person within minutes. Frostbite could occur on exposed skin in under 5 minutes at 27 below with 40-mile-per-hour winds. The wind chill equivalent was approximately 70 degrees below zero. Men died in storms like this, walking between their cabin door and their outhouse, 30 feet away, when they lost their bearings in whiteout conditions and wandered in circles until they collapsed. In Drennan's system, nobody went outside. The woodpile was in the junction hall. The junction hall was connected to every cabin by an enclosed, insulated corridor. Families moved between their private cabins and the shared central space, where Drennan maintained the fire without ever stepping into the storm. At 3:15 a.m., on January 15th, with the storm at its peak intensity, Drennan recorded the following temperatures: exterior, -29 degrees, junction hall, 59 degrees, Drennan corridor, 48 degrees, Drennan cabin, 55 degrees, Hargrove corridor, 43 degrees, Hargrove cabin, 51 degrees, Merriweather corridor, 47 degrees, Merriweather cabin, 52 degrees. Every occupied space in the system was above 50 degrees. Every corridor, unheated passages that skeptics had said would be ice tunnels by January, was above 40 degrees, functioning as thermal buffers exactly as designed. The warm air circulating from the junction hall through the upper portions of the corridors lost heat gradually along their length, arriving at each cabin cooler but still well above freezing, where the cabin's own insulation retained enough of it to maintain livable conditions. This was not magic. This was not luck. This was thermal physics operating exactly as Drennan had predicted, validated by the most extreme conditions the Bitterroot Valley had produced in recorded memory. Meanwhile, 3 miles east along the valley, a family named Taggart, Robert and Ellen Taggart, and their 4 children, was fighting for survival in a conventional single fireplace cabin. Robert Taggart had cut and stacked 22 cords of firewood before winter, a prodigious supply by any standard, but his woodpile was 80 feet from his cabin door. When the storm struck, he made 3 trips to the woodpile before dark, each time fighting through deepening snow and wind that tore at his clothing and drove ice crystals into his eyes. On his 3rd trip, at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he fell. His right foot caught on a buried stump, and he went down hard, striking his forehead on the corner of the wood rack. He lay in the snow for what he later estimated was 3 or 4 minutes, dazed, bleeding, the wind screaming around him, before he managed to stand and stagger back to the cabin with an armload of wood that he could barely hold. He did not go out again. What he had carried in lasted until approximately 11 o'clock that night. After that, the Taggarts burned their kitchen table. They burned 2 chairs. They burned the frame of a bed. By morning, the interior of their cabin had dropped to 23 degrees, and 2 of their children, ages 3 and 5, were showing signs of moderate hypothermia. Shivering had stopped, Their responses were sluggish, and the 3-year-old's lips were blue. They survived. All of them survived because Ellen Taggart wrapped the children in every piece of fabric in the cabin and held them against her body for 14 hours straight, using her own metabolic heat as their primary heat source. But the 5-year-old, a boy named William, developed pneumonia within a week. He died on January 29th. He was buried in frozen ground that Robert Taggart spent 2 days chopping open with a pickaxe, working in 12-minute intervals because that was how long he could swing the tool before his hands went numb. William Taggart's death was not unusual. Across Montana Territory, the January 1880 blizzard killed an estimated 23 people directly through exposure and contributed to an unknown number of additional deaths from illness in the following weeks. It was, by contemporary accounts, the most severe winter storm to strike the territory since organized settlement began. And 3 miles from where a 5-year-old boy died because his father could not reach his own woodpile, 4 families slept in temperatures above 50 degrees in cabins connected to a fire they never had to leave shelter to feed. The storm broke on January 16th at approximately 7 in the morning. The wind dropped first, then the snow tapered to flurries by noon. The sky cleared by 3 o'clock, revealing a landscape so thoroughly transformed by snow that familiar landmarks had simply vanished under drifts that in places reached the eaves of the cabins. Drennan opened the junction hall's exterior door, the only exterior access point in the entire connected system, and found a wall of snow 4 feet deep. He dug a path to his thermometer. It read 14 below zero, warmer than it had been in 36 hours, but still brutally cold. Inside, behind him, the junction hall was 58 degrees. In the corridors, the residual heat of the most recent fire kept the passageways above 40. In the cabins, families were already moving, talking, beginning the ordinary business of the day. Thomas Hargrove was the first person from outside the system to reach the clearing on January 18th, 2 days after the storm broke. He had been in his own connected cabin throughout the storm, of course, but something about the aftermath seemed to compel him to formalize what the experience had demonstrated. He walked to the junction hall where Drennan was splitting kindling, and he stood for a moment in the doorway with snow melting off his boots onto the stone floor that was still radiating warmth from the morning fire. "I was wrong," he said, "about most of it. I was wrong." Drennan set down the hatchet. "You were right about the social part," he said. "We had 2 arguments about the fire schedule in December." Hargrove almost smiled. "Did anyone die?" "No." "Then I was wrong about that too." Margaret Colville came to the junction hall on January 19th. She came through the corridor that had been built to her wall but never opened through it. She walked around the outside, through snow that reached her waist, because the corridor's exterior door on the junction hall end was the only way in, and she had never connected. She was carrying a blanket wrapped around a cast iron pot that contained a venison stew that had frozen solid in her cabin overnight. Her cabin, unconnected to the system, had dropped to 19 degrees during the storm's worst hours. She had kept her children alive by the same method Ellen Taggart had used: body heat and blankets and relentless, exhausting vigilance. Her 8-year-old daughter, Eleanor, had cried for 6 hours straight from the cold on the first night, a thin, persistent sound that Margaret would later say she heard in her sleep for years afterward. Margaret set the frozen pot on the junction hall hearth without speaking. The stew began to thaw. She watched it for a while, then looked at Drennan. "Cut through my wall," she said. Samuel Colville had the opening made by sunset. He had been waiting. He had pre-cut the logs at the appropriate location weeks earlier, scoring them on the interior side where his mother wouldn't see, so that when the word came, he only needed to complete the cuts and remove the sections. The damper panel, like Hargrove's, had been built by Drennan well in advance. Warm air from the junction hall began flowing into the Colville cabin within an hour of the wall being opened. Margaret Colville stood in the corridor connecting her home to the central hearth and put her hand against the wall, feeling the warmth radiating through the clay plaster. David, her 12-year-old, was already sitting in the corridor, his favorite spot since October. Eleanor, the 8-year-old who had cried for 6 hours in the cold, walked into the junction hall, felt the warmth of the hearth, and sat down on the stone floor next to it. She did not cry. She did not say anything. She simply sat there, absorbing heat, with an expression on her face that adults would have called relief, but that, at 8 years old, was something simpler and more profound. The feeling of a problem being solved by someone who had thought about it long enough and carefully enough to get it right. The rest of the winter of 1879 to 1880 was severe by any standard. February brought 2 additional storms, neither as extreme as the January blizzard, but both producing temperatures below -15 and significant snowfall, and the connected system performed consistently throughout. Drennan's fuel records, meticulously maintained through the entire season, showed a total consumption of 16.5 cords of firewood from November 1st through March 31st. This was slightly above his predicted range of 14 to 19 cords, attributable to the January blizzard's extraordinary demands, but still represented a 76% reduction compared to the estimated 68 to 75 cords that 4 independent cabins would have required. The system had not merely worked, it had worked under conditions that exceeded its design parameters, and it had continued to work because the fundamental physics were sound, the construction was careful, and the thermal mass provided a margin of safety that no conventional fireplace could match. When the mathematics are right, the mathematics remain right even when the world turns hostile. That is the difference between a theory and a principle. By spring of 1880, the Sleeping Creek connected settlement was no longer an oddity to be mocked. It was a proof of concept that other settlers came to study. Orrin Pratt, the trading post operator who had called the project an elaborate coffin the previous July, visited on March 8th and spent an entire day measuring corridor dimensions, examining the hearth construction, and asking questions about the damper system. He did not reference his earlier assessment. Drennan did not remind him. Pratt ordered bricks from Fort Missoula the following week and spent the summer of 1880 constructing a modified version of Drennan's hearth design for a 2-building connected system at his trading post, a system that would serve him for the next 23 years. Robert Taggart visited on April 2nd. He had buried his son in January and spent February rebuilding his family's will to remain in Montana at all. He walked through the corridors slowly, touching the walls, looking at the damper panels, studying the fire doors with their sand troughs. He asked Drennan one question: "Would you help me build this?" Drennan spent 3 weeks at the Taggart homestead that May, laying the foundation for a connected system that would link the Taggart cabin to a new junction hall and a second cabin that Taggart was building for his brother's family, who were arriving from Nebraska in June. The Taggarts never lost another child to cold. If this story has resonated with you, if you believe that the practical wisdom of people like Elias Drennan deserves to be remembered and shared, please consider leaving a comment and subscribing to this channel. These narratives take extensive research to develop, and your support directly enables us to continue this work of preservation. The connected cabin concept spread through the Bitterroot Valley and into adjacent regions over the following decade, with the quiet persistence of an idea that simply worked. By 1885, at least 11 connected settlements existed in western Montana Territory, ranging from simple 2-cabin systems to one ambitious 7-structure complex near Stevensville that served as a de facto community center, school, and emergency shelter for the surrounding area. By 1890, the principle had influenced the design of early ranch complexes throughout the northern Rockies, where connected buildings with shared heating systems became standard practice for operations that needed to maintain multiple structures through extreme winters. The term Drennan system appeared in a brief mention in the Missoula Gazette in November 1883 in an article about winter preparedness, but the name did not stick. By the time the connected building concept became widespread, its origin had already begun to blur. Settlers who adopted the principle attributed it to common sense, or the way they do it in Scandinavia, or simply how things are done here. This is how innovation works on the frontier. A solution proves itself through the most honest test available, survival, and then it spreads not through publication or patent or promotion, but through imitation. Neighbors see what works, they copy it, they modify it, they forget where it came from. The idea becomes infrastructure, then tradition, then assumption. Within a generation, nobody remembers that it was ever controversial. Nobody remembers that a man was mocked for proposing it. Nobody remembers the name. Elias Drennan died on February 11, 1917, at the age of 65, in the same cabin he had built in 1879, still connected to the junction hall, still heated by the same masonry hearth he had constructed with hand-fired bricks 38 years earlier. The hearth had been repointed twice, the corridors resheathed once, and the original damper panels replaced with improved versions in 1894, but the fundamental system was unchanged. His obituary in the Missoula Sentinel was 4 sentences long. It mentioned that he was a mason by trade, that he was survived by his wife and 3 children, that he had been a resident of the Bitterroot Valley for 38 years, and that services would be held at the Methodist Church in Hamilton. It did not mention the connected cabin system. It did not mention the junction hall or the masonry hearth or the corridors or the dual flue safety design or the 76% reduction in fuel consumption or the fact that his engineering had kept 4 families alive through the worst blizzard in Montana territorial history. It did not mention any of that because by 1917, connected building systems were so common in the region that mentioning them would have been like noting that a man had built a door. The innovation had become invisible through its own success, the highest form of vindication and the most complete form of anonymity. Today, the principles that Drennan applied in 1879 are fundamental to modern sustainable architecture. Thermal mass heating, radiant floor systems, connected building envelopes, ventilated rain screen wall assemblies, adjustable zone heating controls. These concepts carry technical names and are taught in engineering programs and implemented with computer modeling and precision manufactured components. But the physics have not changed. A 6,000-pound masonry core absorbs heat and releases it slowly, whether it is built by a frontier mason working by candlelight or designed by a team of engineers with thermal imaging software. The mathematics do not care about the century. They care about what works. The ruins of Drennan's Junction Hall were still partially standing as late as 1943, when a survey team documenting historic structures in the Bitterroot Valley photographed the remains and noted, with evident puzzlement, the unusual masonry hearth construction and the foundation traces of radiating corridors whose purpose they could not immediately identify. Their report described the site as an unusual communal structure of unknown function, possibly religious in nature. It was not religious, it was practical. It was a man who remembered the blue tinge of his uncle's lips, who spent 18 years learning why it happened and how to prevent it, who then stood in a muddy clearing between 4 cabins and saw not 4 problems, but one system, who endured months of ridicule and resistance, who built something that skeptics called an elaborate coffin, and who then sat in that supposedly impossible structure at 3 in the morning during the worst storm anyone had ever seen, recording temperatures, checking telltales, feeding a fire that kept 4 families warm through a night that killed people 3 miles away. The shed and corridor system that surrounded those cabins looked strange to every person who saw it that first summer. It looked like over-engineering, like foreign nonsense, like a waste of effort that would collapse under its first real snow load. But it held. It held through a storm that produced 70 below wind chills and 41 hours of sustained fury. It held through 38 Montana winters. It held because the mathematics were sound, the construction was careful, and the man who built it understood something that his neighbors had to learn through crisis. The frontier does not care about tradition. It does not care about what looks right or sounds reasonable or has always been done before. It cares about what works when the temperature drops to 29 below and the wind is screaming and your woodpile is 80 feet away and you cannot reach it. 1 fire, 4 families, all winter. They said it was impossible. The hearth said otherwise.